Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Mining Journal, and I'm here with Dr Robert Pell, founder and director of environmental lifecycle assessment consultant Minviro. This is the first part of a three-part series that we're doing as part of our climate change program, and we're looking at the broader implications of climate targets at the moment at a more practical site level. Hi, Rob.
Hiya.
Can you start by giving us just an understanding for those who don't already know what lifecycle assessment involves?
Yeah, of course. So life cycle assessment is a methodology to quantify environmental impacts. It covers a broad range of impact categories. So everybody obviously knows the climate change impact category, but it covers other sectors like water-related impacts, land use footprint, as well as dust emissions, and a range of other factors like acidification. It has its own ISO standards. It's been around for some decades, but only recently sort of widely adopted in the mining sector.
Why has it only been recently adopted in the mining sector?
That's an interesting question. I think, there's been a lot of pressure from the technology material value chain to have life cycle assessment data in recent years. And that's because life cycle assessment is really the language of the downstream consumers of technology materials.
Okay. Okay. A lot of the conversation, as we've touched on already, is around the targets that are being set down out to 2050. Not that much of the conversation from what we've seen has been around real site level application and the implications, particularly what's being measured to identify mitigation opportunities. From your perspective, dealing with companies at site level, what needs to change there and what are the key points that mining companies need to understand?
Well, I think the first point that needs to be understood is you need to capture the data at the site level to understand the impact. We're seeing a trend for more environmental performance benchmarking across the sites. But if you're going to make any improvements at the site level, you need to know exactly where the environmental hotspots exist. Is it stuff that you're consuming? Is it electricity? Is it explosives? Or is it a reagent in a processing plant? So that's the first step. And then once you have that data, you can use approaches like life cycle assessment to make environmentally informed decisions about your next steps, your project. So if you're thinking about, say, transitioning to electric fleet rather than a diesel fleet, what's the actual environmental value proposition of that? What kind of tonnage of CO2 are you going to save per kilogram of product?
Okay. And from what you're seeing with the companies that you're working with, what kind of variance are we looking at? You talked about hotspots. What are the hotspots? What kind of trends are you seeing, and how does it differ in terms of the ratios when we're looking through the different scopes of emissions, 1 through 3? A very broad question. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. We see a huge range. I think it depends where you're drawing the boundary of your life cycle assessment.
Okay.
At a mine site, say at a conventional open pit mine, there tends to be relative consistency in environmental impact. Some of the factors that can influence that is obviously grade. Potentially, what the deposit actually looks like, the shape of the pit, in underground mining, what kind of, again, grade, penalty elements, stuff like that. But if you broaden the scope and you're starting to incorporate, the mineral processing or even the refining further downstream, there are, it becomes, more expansive in terms of the parameters that can actually influence the overall impact. So that's why life cycle assessment needs to not just look at an individual site level, but broaden out the scope as well, looking downstream, the downstream impacts.
Is that message getting across? We speak to quite a few corporates that don't want to engage with the full value chain. Are you finding that mentality is changing, or is mining at risk of being stuck in its ways?
I mean, I think in the last, in the last year, we've seen a really rapid change of thought. Understanding that, especially when we're talking about the materials that are, essential for the low carbon transition, I think there's a clear understanding that those materials, when they get into, say, the electric vehicles or the wind turbines, they need to have a relative low impact. And that means that you can't sort of just sit in your silo, understand the impact of your particular part of the value chain and not think upstream or downstream. It's obviously much easier to control what you can control at the site level, but we're also seeing, life cycle assessment being used more to identify the risks in your supply chain as well when you're purchasing materials or reagents.
Okay, and with the level of data that's being created, it feels like the volumes are intensifying around the intensification of the focus around climate change, a lot more data. how is that spilling over into the other areas that you're assessing when you're looking at the environmental impact of a mining operation?
Yeah, of course. I think when you're doing life cycle assessment, you're not just capturing the direct impacts at the site. You're considering, say, the embodied impacts of producing the ANFO, the embodied impacts of generating the electricity, and having that level of data and that level of granularity, you can look at other impact categories as well. So climate change is obviously so important, but if you're, say, producing or consuming, say, a reagent which has a high impact in particulate matter emissions elsewhere, or you're using chemicals that have high water consumption in a water scarce region elsewhere, that data can still be used and identified and managed.
Robert Pell, thanks for your time.
Thanks.